Picture this moment. General Mbaye Cissé stands resolute in the morning sun of Dakar, witnessing the lowering of the French tricolor for the final time at Camp Gale. After 65 years of foreign military occupation disguised as partnership, Senegal has finally reclaimed complete sovereignty over its own soil. This isn't merely a ceremonial transfer of keys, this is the crystallization of a continental awakening that strikes at the very heart of neocolonial architecture. What we witnessed Thursday morning represents far more than military logistics. We are observing the systematic dismantling of France's most cherished imperial instrument, the perpetual military presence that has guaranteed French economic extraction from Africa for over half a century. President Bassirou Diomaye Faye's declaration that Senegal would expel all foreign military forces by 2025 reverberates across the Sahel like thunder before a cleansing storm. This moment arrives precisely as France confronts its most devastating diplomatic collapse in modern African history. From the gold mines of Burkina Faso to the uranium deposits of Niger, from the cotton fields of Mali to the strategic ports of Senegal, African nations are systematically severing the umbilical cords of dependency that have strangled their sovereignty since the false dawn of independence. But let us be absolutely clear about what this represents. This is not chaos. This is African agency asserting itself with surgical precision. This is not instability. This is the natural correction of an artificial colonial arrangement that should have ended decades ago. When President Faye declares that sovereignty does not accept the presence of military bases in a sovereign country, he articulates a truth so fundamental that its previous absence reveals the depth of imperial psychological conditioning. The French military presence in Senegal wasn't protection, it was insurance. Insurance against authentic African leadership that might prioritize Senegalese interests over French corporate profits. Insurance against the kind of Pan-African unity that could challenge the CFA franc system. Insurance against the emergence of leaders who understood that true independence requires not just political autonomy, but economic sovereignty and strategic self-determination. Today, that insurance policy has expired. To comprehend the magnitude of this moment, we must excavate the historical foundations upon which French neocolonialism constructed its African empire. The military bases that Senegal just reclaimed were never temporary installations. They were permanent fixtures of a system designed to ensure that African independence remained largely ceremonial. When Senegal achieved nominal independence in 1960, France embedded within the independence agreements a series of mechanisms that would guarantee continued French dominance. The most insidious of these was the bilateral defense agreement that legitimized permanent French military presence under the guise of security cooperation. This wasn't partnership, it was occupation with diplomatic immunity. The French military bases served multiple interconnected functions within the broader architecture of Françafrique. They provided rapid intervention capabilities to protect French economic interests, maintain logistical networks for resource extraction, and most crucially, served as psychological anchors that reminded African leaders of the consequences of straying too far from French preferences. The message was unmistakable. African sovereignty extended only as far as French tolerance would permit. Consider the historical precedent. Every significant challenge to French hegemony in West Africa has been met with military intervention, from the assassination of Sylvanus Olympio in Togo to the overthrow of Laurent Gbagbo in Ivory Coast. French forces have consistently demonstrated their willingness to destabilize any African leader who threatens the colonial economic compact. The bases in Senegal provided the infrastructure for these interventions and the forward positioning that made them possible. The symbolic weight of President Faye's announcement on the 80th anniversary of the Thiaroye massacre cannot be overstated. On December 1st, 1944, French colonial forces murdered hundreds of African soldiers who had fought courageously for France's liberation from Nazi occupation. These tirailleurs Senegalais returned home demanding basic dignity, timely payment of their salaries, and humane treatment, only to be slaughtered by the very military apparatus they had served. President Macron's recent admission that France committed a massacre at Thiaroye represents more than historical acknowledgement. It reveals the fundamental contradiction at the heart of French-African relations. How can a nation that massacred African veterans claim to provide security for African peoples? How can military bases established to protect French extraction industries claim to serve African interests? The broader context reveals that Senegal's decision emerges from a continental pattern of African nations recognizing that genuine security cannot be outsourced to former colonial powers. The coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger weren't random expressions of military ambition. They were systematic rejections of the French security model that had failed to protect African populations while succeeding brilliantly in protecting French corporate interests. Each of these military governments explicitly identified French military presence as a source of instability rather than security. They recognized that foreign military bases created strategic vulnerabilities, attracted external conflicts, and provided mechanisms for political interference that undermined genuine sovereignty. The ejection of 4,300 French soldiers from the Sahel represents African leaders learning from experience and choosing African solutions to African challenges. Senegal's peaceful transition to this same conclusion demonstrates the intellectual maturity of African leadership. President Faye didn't require military intervention to reach the same strategic assessment. He recognized that true sovereignty demands complete control over national territory, including the military forces that operate within it. This represents the evolution of African political consciousness from reactive nationalism to proactive strategic planning. President Bassirou Diomaye Faye's ascension to power represents a new generation of African leadership that refuses to accept the artificial constraints imposed by colonial-era agreements. His declaration that Senegal would expel all foreign military forces by 2025 wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the culmination of decades of Senegalese reflection on the costs of continued French military presence. The sophistication of Faye's approach deserves particular attention. Rather than dramatic confrontation, he chose strategic inevitability. By announcing a timeline for complete withdrawal, he provided France with the opportunity to maintain dignity while making the outcome non-negotiable. This represents the kind of diplomatic maturity that European commentators consistently claim African leaders lack. Yet here we witness a masterclass in strategic communication that achieves maximum results with minimal disruption. The economic implications of Senegal's decision extend far beyond military arrangements. French military bases served as crucial nodes in the broader network of French economic control. They provided security for French corporations operating in Senegal, facilitated the movement of resources toward French markets, and created psychological pressure that discouraged economic diversification away from French partnerships. Consider the extractive industries that have defined Senegal's economy since independence. Phosphate mining, groundnut production, and fishing rights have operated under frameworks that prioritize French access over Senegalese development. The military bases provided the implicit guarantee that any Senegalese government threatening these arrangements would face immediate consequences. With that guarantee removed, Senegal gains unprecedented freedom to negotiate partnerships that serve Senegalese interests first. The timing of Senegal's decision coincides with the discovery of significant oil and gas reserves off the Senegalese coast. These resources represent the potential for economic transformation that could finally break the cycle of dependency that has characterized Senegalese development since independence. However, realizing this potential requires the kind of strategic autonomy that becomes impossible when foreign military forces maintain permanent presence on national territory. President Faye's government has demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking in connecting military sovereignty to economic sovereignty. They understand that controlling natural resources requires controlling the security apparatus that protects those resources. They recognize that negotiating favorable partnerships requires requires the credible threat of alternative arrangements, a threat that becomes meaningless when foreign military forces can intervene to protect existing arrangements. The regional implications of Senegal's decision create cascading effects throughout West Africa. Senegal's stability and democratic traditions have provided France with a crucial argument for maintaining military presence throughout the region. French officials consistently pointed to Senegal as evidence that their military presence enhanced rather than undermined African stability. With Senegal definitively rejecting this model, France loses its most compelling example of successful military cooperation in West Africa. The governments of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger can now point to Senegal's democratic decision as validation of their own military interventions to expel French forces. This creates a unified regional narrative that frames French military presence as incompatible with genuine sovereignty. The psychological impact of Senegal's decision reverberates throughout Francophone Africa. For decades, French officials and their African allies have argued that military independence represented dangerous adventurism that would inevitably lead to instability and economic collapse. Senegal's peaceful transition to complete military sovereignty demolishes this narrative and provides a model for other African nations contemplating similar decisions. The sophistication of Senegal's approach extends to their management of the transition process itself. Rather than immediate expulsion, they negotiated a phased withdrawal that allows for proper transfer of responsibilities while maintaining regional stability. This demonstrates the kind of administrative competence that European critics consistently claim African governments lack. Yet here, we witness planning and execution that surpasses European standards. The broader continental context reveals that Senegal's decision represents part of a coordinated African response to French neocolonialism. The African Union's increasing emphasis on continental solutions to African challenges finds expression in Senegal's decision to prioritize African security partnerships over traditional colonial arrangements. This alignment between national sovereignty and continental unity represents the maturation of Pan-African consciousness in practical policy terms. The French response to Senegal's decision reveals the depth of imperial psychology that continues to characterize French-African relations. French officials consistently frame African decisions to expel French forces as evidence of African ingratitude rather than African agency. This paternalistic response demonstrates precisely why French military presence was incompatible with genuine African sovereignty. The economic data supporting Senegal's decision provides compelling evidence for the wisdom of their approach. Despite decades of French military presence, Senegal remains among the world's least developed countries with massive youth unemployment and persistent poverty. The French military bases protected French economic interests while providing minimal benefit to Senegalese development. This represents a fundamental misalignment of interests that military cooperation cannot resolve. The generational dimension of Senegal's decision deserves particular emphasis. Young Senegalese have grown up witnessing the failure of French-led development models while observing the success of African nations that pursued independent development strategies. Countries like Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Ghana have demonstrated that African nations can achieve rapid development without sacrificing sovereignty to former colonial powers. President Faye's government represents this generational shift in African political consciousness. They refuse to accept the artificial constraints imposed by previous generations of African leaders who internalized colonial assumptions about African incapacity. This represents the emergence of African leadership that takes African competence as a given rather than something to be proven to European observers. The expulsion of French military forces from Senegal represents a seismic shift in West African geopolitics that extends far beyond bilateral Franco-Senegalese relations. We are witnessing the collapse of France's most successful post-colonial project, the maintenance of imperial control through military presence disguised as cooperation. France's West African strategy has always depended on maintaining a network of military bases that that could provide rapid intervention capabilities throughout the region. Senegal's democratic location provided the perfect headquarters for this network, offering political legitimacy that military governments in other countries could not provide. With Senegal definitively rejecting this role, France loses its most crucial strategic asset in West Africa. The timing of Senegal's decision coincides with China's Belt and Road Initiative gaining unprecedented momentum throughout Africa. Chinese investment in African infrastructure has reached $170 billion annually, dwarfing traditional European development assistance. Unlike French military bases, Chinese investment comes without permanent foreign military presence and without requirements to maintain colonial-era economic arrangements. President Faye's government has strategically positioned Senegal to benefit from this shifting global dynamic. By expelling French military forces, they create space for diversified partnerships that serve Senegalese interests rather than French corporate profits. This represents the kind of strategic thinking that transforms geopolitical constraints into opportunities for enhanced sovereignty. The regional security implications of Senegal's decision extend throughout the Sahel. French military intervention in Mali, Libya, and Ivory Coast has consistently created more instability than it resolved. The French military presence attracted external conflicts, created dependency relationships that undermined local capacity, and provided mechanisms for political interference that prevented genuine conflict resolution. Senegal's decision to prioritize African security solutions over French military presence aligns with broader continental trends toward enhanced African peacekeeping capabilities. The African Union's peace and security architecture has developed substantial capacity over the past decade, with successful interventions in Somalia, Central African Republic, and Democratic Republic of Congo demonstrating African ability to manage African security challenges. The economic implications of Senegal's decision create ripple effects throughout global commodity markets. Senegal's phosphate reserves, groundnut production, and emerging oil and gas resources have operated under frameworks that prioritize French access over global market dynamics. With French military guarantees removed, Senegal gains freedom to negotiate partnerships that maximize revenue for Senegalese development. The broader implications for French foreign policy cannot be overstated. Senegal represented France's most successful example of post-colonial cooperation in Africa. French officials consistently pointed to Senegal's stability and democratic traditions as evidence that French military presence enhanced rather than undermined African development. With Senegal definitively rejecting this model, France loses its most compelling argument for maintaining military presence throughout Africa. The psychological impact of Senegal's decision reverberates throughout Francophone Africa. Countries like Cameroon, Gabon, and Chad have maintained French military presence based partly on the assumption that Senegal's success validated this model. With Senegal choosing complete military sovereignty, these countries face increased pressure to justify continued French military presence to their populations. The global implications of Senegal's decision extend beyond Africa. Developing nations throughout Asia and Latin America are observing how African countries successfully challenge neocolonial arrangements that previous generations accepted as permanent. This creates potential for similar sovereignty movements in other regions where former colonial powers maintain disproportionate influence. The strategic implications for American foreign policy in Africa also deserve attention. The United States has increasingly relied on French military presence to maintain stability in regions where American forces are not permanently stationed. With French military capability diminishing throughout West Africa, American policymakers must develop alternative strategies for engaging with African security challenges. The implications for global governance institutions reflect the broader transformation of international relations away from colonial-era hierarchies toward genuine multipolarity. Senegal's decision represents African agency asserting itself in ways that challenge European assumptions about African incapacity and dependency. This contributes to the broader global trend toward enhanced sovereignty for developing nations. The technological implications of Senegal's decision also merit consideration. French military bases served as crucial nodes in intelligence networks that monitored African political developments and provided early warning of potential threats to French interests. With these capabilities removed, France loses crucial intelligence gathering capacity that will be difficult to replace through diplomatic channels. The environmental implications of Senegal's decision reflect broader African concerns about climate change and resource management. French military bases consume significant resources while providing minimal environmental benefit to Senegalese populations. The land and resources previously devoted to French military presence can now be redirected towards Senegalese development priorities, including renewable energy infrastructure and sustainable agriculture. The cultural significance of Senegal's decision to expel French military forces extends far beyond military logistics to encompass fundamental questions of African identity, dignity, and self-determination. For 65 years, the presence of French military bases on Senegalese soil served as daily reminders of incomplete independence and continued subordination to former colonial masters. The psychological impact of foreign military presence on African consciousness cannot be overstated. Every Senegalese child who grew up seeing French soldiers patrolling their homeland internalized messages about African incapacity and European superiority. These messages became embedded in educational systems, cultural institutions, and social hierarchies that privileged European knowledge over African wisdom. President Faye's decision to expel French forces represents a fundamental assertion of African dignity that resonates throughout the continent. Young Africans across the Sahel are witnessing proof that African leaders can successfully challenge European dominance without catastrophic consequences. This demonstration of African agency provides psychological liberation that extends far beyond military arrangements. The linguistic implications of Senegal's decision deserve particular attention. French military presence reinforced the privileged status of French language and culture within Senegalese society. French bases served as cultural outposts that promoted French educational models, French business practices, and French social hierarchies that marginalized indigenous Senegalese cultures. With French military presence removed, Senegal gains unprecedented opportunity to revitalize indigenous languages, traditional knowledge systems, and cultural practices that colonialism attempted to eliminate. The land previously occupied by French military bases can now be dedicated to cultural institutions that celebrate Senegalese heritage rather than French imperial nostalgia. The generational dimension of this cultural transformation cannot be ignored. Young Senegalese have increasingly embraced African cultural expressions, from music and fashion to philosophy and spirituality, that reject European cultural supremacy. President Faye's decision validates these cultural choices and provides political support for African cultural renaissance. The broader continental implications extend to Pan-African cultural movements that emphasize African unity over colonial divisions. Senegal's decision to prioritize African security partnerships over French military presence aligns with cultural movements that celebrate African civilizational achievements while rejecting European cultural colonialism. The artistic and intellectual implications of Senegal's decision create space for African creativity that doesn't require European validation. Senegalese artists, writers, and intellectuals can now explore themes of sovereignty, independence, and African agency without fear that French military presence might create political consequences for cultural expression. The religious implications also merit consideration. French military presence reinforced secular European models that often conflicted with African spiritual traditions. With French forces removed, Senegal gains freedom to develop approaches to governance and social organization that incorporate African spiritual wisdom alongside modern institutional frameworks. What we have witnessed in Senegal represents far more than a single nation's decision to expel foreign military forces. We have observed the crystallization of a continental awakening that challenges the very foundations of neocolonial control. President Bassirou Diomaye Faye's strategic leadership has provided a template for African sovereignty that combines diplomatic sophistication with unwavering commitment to genuine independence. the implications of Senegal's decision will reverberate throughout Africa and beyond for generations. Young Africans across the continent now possess concrete evidence that African leaders can successfully challenge European dominance without catastrophic consequences. This demonstration of African agency provides psychological liberation that extends far beyond military arrangements. The systematic expulsion of French military forces from West Africa, from Mali to Niger, from Burkina Faso to Senegal, represents the most significant challenge to European neocolonialism since the independence movements of the 1960s. Unlike previous challenges, this movement combines military strategic thinking with economic planning and cultural renaissance in ways that create sustainable foundations for genuine sovereignty. The French Empire's West African project is collapsing not through external intervention, but through African agency asserting itself with surgical precision. This represents the triumph of African wisdom over European manipulation, African strategic thinking over European psychological conditioning, and African dignity over European paternalism. The future of Franco-African relations will be determined by France's ability to accept genuine partnership based on mutual respect rather than colonial nostalgia. African nations have demonstrated their capacity for independent development and their commitment to sovereignty. The question now is whether France can adapt to this new reality or whether it will continue clinging to imperial fantasies that African reality has already rendered obsolete. But this analysis reaches you through this platform, and your engagement directly supports the broader African sovereignty movement. Every like, every share, every comment contributes to amplifying African voices in global conversations dominated by European perspectives. If this analysis resonated with you, if you believe in African agency and sovereignty, then I need you to take specific action right now. Hit that like button to signal your support for African sovereignty. Share this video with friends and family who need to understand what's really happening in Africa. Subscribe to this channel and ring that notification bell because we're committed to providing the African perspective on global events that mainstream media consistently ignores or misrepresents. Your engagement isn't just social media activity, it's participation in the information war for African dignity and self-determination. Together, we can ensure that African voices shape African narratives and that African agency receives the recognition it deserves.